Welcome to this online lesson looking at public health and its developments in the 19th century. It's going to be quite a long one this and quite important, so you might want to do it in more than one sitting. But before we get started, we're going to have a look at an incredibly famous source. It's called A Court for King Cholera, a cartoon produced in the 19th century. Here's your do now task. List the public health dangers that you can see being shown in this source. It was produced in the 1840s at a time when public health in London was incredibly bad. So pause the video now and let's see what you can come up with. Alright, here's some suggestions. You might well have got other ones. We can see, quite obviously, there are children playing in a big pile of rubbish. I hate to think what's actually in there. People are also eating from the rubbish. The poor might pick through scraps that other people had discarded if they were truly desperate. Or they might try and pick through and find anything that was valuable that could be used or maybe sold. Children are shown playing with rats in the streets. Here some children are playing with a dead rat. We can see that there is dirty washing in the streets as well. And there's overcrowding in the houses. You might be able to just make out on the sign there it says lodgings for travellers. We've also got tipping waste from the streets. Little regard for what hygiene causes that might contribute to in the street below. We also have possibly unhygienic disposal of the dead. Or perhaps we should read this more as a sign of the high mortality in cities at this time. If you missed out on any of these examples, by all means add them to your notes now. If not, we'll proceed. A Court for King Cholera. Public health in London in the 1800s. Our aims in this lesson are to know the main problems with public health in the 19th century, to explain the causes of these problems, and to evaluate the impact of the Industrial Revolution on medicine. It's worth pointing out that although we're going to be focusing largely on London, many of these issues affected other industrialised cities in the 19th century. But London is a particularly good case study. It shows all of the main problems, also shows many of the solutions to them, and you can apply your knowledge of London to those other cities as well. Here's a bit of a starter then, just to get you thinking. How might these pictures here give us clues about things that cause public health problems? Pause the video while you consider that, and then we'll have a look at some answers. Well, first of all, we've got the map of the British Empire. Travel can cause disease, although it's much slower than it is today with air travel. Nevertheless, diseases could be brought from the Empire back to England. Then we got the photograph of all the people. A big crowd you can see. Population increase. Then we have some people using a water pump. Waterborne diseases, as it would turn out, would be very deadly, although many people didn't realise they were carried in the water until too late. And we can also see the cramped and poor quality housing that many poor people had to live in, with an open sewer running down the street. So that gives us an idea of many of the problems that existed. Some key terms for you then. In Cloak's compendium of annoying old-fashioned words that you need to know today are public health, actions that a government takes to protect the health of the people. Industrial Revolution, period in which factories and machines became the main economic power instead of farming. This was around 1750 to 1900 in Britain. Cholera, deadly infectious disease spread by dirty water. It caused death through diarrhoea, dehydration and organ failure. Epidemic, widespread outbreak of disease in a particular area of community. There were repeated epidemics of cholera. And lastly, laissez-faire. This comes from the French for do nothing or do little. This is the idea that government shouldn't be involved in the day-to-day lives. They should instead leave things to themselves, or take an attitude of what will be, will be. Do these tasks then. Firstly, record or describe each of the key terms. Secondly, why might people before the 1860s have assumed cholera was caused by bad smells? Thirdly, why might laissez-faire be harmful to public health? And as an extension, what might be the difference between an epidemic and a pandemic? Pause the video while you complete those tasks. So people might have assumed that cholera was caused by bad smells because it was often associated with places that were unhygienic and really stank. And don't forget that before germ theory, people still believed in the theory of miasma. And actually, that theory stuck around for quite a bit after germ theory as well. Laissez-faire may be harmful for public health because, actually, things were changing, and that meant that things were getting worse. Without action, things would continue to get worse, and it needed some sort of organisation that would have an impact on everyone. The government was the ones to do it. If they had an attitude of do nothing or do little or leave things as they are, then things would never get better, they could only really get worse. An epidemic and a pandemic are similar, but not quite the same. An epidemic might happen in a particular country or in a particular city. A pandemic, though, refers to a disease that is affecting virtually all the world, like the coronavirus pandemic of recent years. What was the effect of the Industrial Revolution? Well, the main effects were as follows. The population grew from 11 million, or roughly that, in 1750 to roughly 40 million plus by 1900. So 150 years might sound like a long time, but when you look at the population growth in previous centuries, this is an absolute rocket. People went from mostly living in the country to living in towns and cities. Also, people stopped working at home and started working for big companies and factories. You see a decline in these so-called cottage industries where people largely employed themselves, and a massive growth in people working for somebody else. Britain also built up a massive empire over this period, stretching right around the world. Some follow-up tasks then. For each of the main effects of the Industrial Revolution, explain how it might have increased the number of problems people face with health and/or disease. Think of the consequences of these things. Think about disease, living conditions, nutrition, good food, and cleanliness. Pause the video now and do that task, explaining each of the effects. Well, firstly, the population growth means that there's likely to be more overcrowding, particularly in the cities. And that's exacerbated by the next point. People started cramming into the cities, which meant that they were living much closer together, there was a lot more filth and a lot more waste to get rid of. All of these things could cause the spread of disease. People stopping working from home and working in big companies and factories meant that there was more likelihood of transmission of disease between workers in a workplace, rather than it being isolated to a single household. And the empire might bring new diseases from around the world. Cholera would be a good example of this. We're now going to have a look at the effects of the growth of towns. You're going to have to create your own diagram like this, so be ready. Firstly, we've got to look at the population growth. The population of the United Kingdom grew from 11 million in 1750 to 40 million in 1900. The graph gives us some sort of idea of just what a steep increase this is. Then there's the fact that people moved into the cities to work in the factories. Cities quickly became overcrowded. This was made worse by poor quality houses. They needed to be built quickly, and they were built very close together and cheaply. Largely they were built by employers for their workers, so they spent the bare minimum on them. Also, towns were filthy. Sewage and rubbish quickly piled up in cities, leading to terrible smells, and also to disease. And of course, people before germ theory associated the diseases with smells. Your tasks then. Make your own copy of this diagram, and again you can illustrate it if you wish. For each section, explain how this may have contributed to public health problems. Explain which factors are linked together. How? And then explain the underlying causes of these changes. Pause the video now while you complete that. It'll probably take you some time, especially if you're going to explain it properly. So now we've had a look at some of the ways that the growth of towns made things worse in terms of public health, let's extend it further. This is the first problem we'll study, overcrowding and slums. Problem number 2, the Great Stink of 1858. Problem number 3, cholera. So our task. You will see some detailed fact files relevant to your study. You must then describe what each problem was and what its effects were. Explain what caused each problem. Explain how each problem was solved, and then link the problems and solutions where relevant. Not all of the problems were solved immediately, and not all of the solutions solved more than one problem, but some did. Okay, in order to do this, it would be a good idea to create a sort of diagram. Here's how you could lay it out. Problem number 1, overcrowding and slums. What was the cause and how was it linked to the Industrial Revolution? What effect did this problem have on public health? Then the same for the Great Stink and for the cholera epidemics. Then they all feed in together. Are any of these problems linked? Then, how was the first problem solved? how was the Great Stink solved, and then how was the problem solved for the cholera epidemics. Then they all link together. Are any of these solutions linked? What you could do is pause the video here and make your own copy of this diagram. A large A3 sheet of paper or a double-page spread and an exercise book would probably be ideal. Alternatively, you could take a screenshot of this, blow it up in size, print it out, or type into it. It's really up to you. But if you're going to do either of those options, then you can just pause it now and you can do that. Ready? Well, let's have a look at some of the fact files, starting with problem number 1. Population growth. Before 1750, there were about 11 million people in Britain, and most of them lived in the countryside. That meant that they were all spread out. By 1900, most people lived in towns and cities and worked in huge factories. Okay, probably not everybody worked in a huge factory, but you get the idea. There's been a massive shift in population here. The population spiralled up to over 40 million people. One consequence of all this is that there was a big increase in the number of people, and these people, especially the poor, were crammed into relatively tiny areas. Slums developed with one or more families crammed into tiny houses. Sometimes they were crammed into single rooms or cellars. People tended to work long hours for low pay, and their health suffered. The old sewage systems that had remained mostly unchanged since the Middle Ages could no longer cope, and filth was everywhere. In the photograph, for example, we can see a basic open sewer in the middle of the street. The factories belched out clouds of smoke and soot from coal fires, and people had no choice but to breathe in the smoke and smog that this created. Smog being a compound word between smoke and fog. Your first task then, complete the first section of your diagram. Describe the cause and how it is linked to the Industrial Revolution, and then explain the effects that this problem had on public health. Pause the video while you get the details down that you need. Let's take a moment to improve our source skills and extend our knowledge of this problem. We've seen this photograph before. This is a typical slum street in Victorian Manchester in around 1865. And here we've got source 2, which is a description of some living conditions in the early 1900s. In the early 1900s, chocolate factory owner Seabohm Rowntree conducted a survey for his workers in order to try and understand their problems and help them. This is an extract listing what one man ate in a week. I will point out that in a future lesson we're going to have a look at Seabohm Rountree's work in more detail. He's one of the few employers that actually sought to improve people's conditions. Most didn't. Monday to Friday, breakfast, tea, bread and jam. Lunch, tea, bread and butter. Dinner, tea, bread and potatoes. It's worth bearing in mind that by boiling your tea didn't only make it more palatable, it actually made it safer too. Saturday, breakfast, none. The food was given to the children. Lunch, bread and butter and a pint of ale. Bear in mind the pint of ale might have seemed like a treat, but also it would provide valuable calories for this person. Dinner, tea and bread. And then on Sunday, breakfast, none. Lunch, tea, bread and butter. Dinner, potatoes stewed with 2 pennyworth of beef and tea. Note that's the only meat consumed in the week, and it would have been a real treat. Some tasks then. What can you infer from source 1 about living conditions in towns and the Industrial Revolution? Remember, this means you have to go beyond the obvious, so don't just identify a risk, but identify something about what that says about the health conditions. Secondly, what can you infer from source 2 about the health of working class people in the early 1900s? Remember, you do this by writing down, I can infer that, then you write the inference, and then you note down the detail or quote from the source that tells you this. Do that twice for each source, and then you've got it there. Pause the video now if you're going to do those source skills. If not, use them to improve your mind map, or rather your diagram. If not, we'll move on. Problem 2, the Great Stink. The severe overcrowding of the cities created horrendous living conditions. The sewage would flow in the streets and be washed into the rivers. The River Thames of the early 19th century was a wide, slow-flowing soup of sewage and filthy water. The smell was literally unbearable. In 1858 there was a hot summer, and the Thames water levels fell. The stench of the river was so bad that Parliament had to meet elsewhere. It was so severe that people believed that the smell could itself kill. This was an age before germ theory of Louis Pasteur, whose work was published in the 1860s, and people were terrified by the smell or miasma that they believed could spread disease and cause illness. As it happened, the smell could not spread the illness, but the sewage and filthy water could. Little could be done without the cause of disease being understood. Even less could be done without Parliament there to sort it out. Alright, complete the next section. Describe the cause and how it is linked to the Industrial Revolution, and explain the effects that this problem had on public health. Pause the video while you complete this section. Let's extend our understanding further with a few more source skills. Here we've got source 3, cartoon from the magazine Punch, which was a popular satirical magazine at the time that often poked fun at authority figures and commented on current affairs. This is called Father Thames Introduces His Offspring to the Fair City of London, a design for a fresco or wall painting in the new Houses of Parliament. It's worth bearing in mind that the Houses of Parliament that we understand today were being built at this very time. The sick children are labelled diphtheria, scrofella and cholera, all diseases that were killing people in London at the time. Clearly it's making some sort of link with the filthy river and these diseases. What can you infer from source 3 about living conditions in towns in the Industrial Revolution? Again, go beyond the obvious here. And also remember that at this time germ theory was not understood. So what is the source actually blaming for these diseases? Pause the video if you're going to include that. If not, we'll move on. Problem number 3, cholera. It's pretty unpleasant, this one. Cholera was a deadly disease. It originated in India and was brought back aboard trading ships entering British ports from the Empire, which Britain had by now built up. Cholera was often fatal, and it provided a very undignified and painful death. First, the victims suffered severe, often explosive diarrhoea. They also suffered from vomiting. This caused terrible dehydration as the victim lost fluids through vomiting and diarrhoea. Then the victim would suffer agonising cramps and painful joints. Their faces would become shrunken and pale as the dehydration worsened until the victim fell into a coma and eventually died. He usually killed in a matter of days. He could occasionally kill in hours. Here we can see the illustration demonstrates the effects that it had on a person. Notice the blue lips as the blood flow is cut off to the face. Many cities were terribly affected by this disease, including Newcastle, Exeter and Liverpool, but London was one of the worst hit. Most people in power thought it was caused by bad smells. It wasn't. It was caused by the sewage getting into drinking water. Think about how the treatment for dehydration is drinking more water. It only makes matters worse. Bearing this in mind, it is hardly surprising it spread given the fact that people use the same water to wash sewage away as they use to drink, wash and do their laundry. Complete the next section. Describe the cause and how it is linked to the Industrial Revolution, then explain the effects that this problem had on public health. Secondarily to that, record and describe the symptoms and effects of cholera as a disease as well, because you will need to understand this. Pause the video while you get all that down. Again, let's use some sources to extend our knowledge. Source 4 shows cholera statistics from the main 19th century epidemics. In 1831-32, there were approximately 32,000 deaths, with 6,536 of those being in London. Notice how accurate the figures are for London. This is of a time when people are starting to get more centralised records. It's actually just before the census records were taken, but it shows that now the technology and sophistication of government was there to record these things. 1848-49, approximately 62,000 deaths, 14,137 of those occurring in London. 1853-4, approximately 20,000 deaths, over half of those were in London. Then 1866-7, approximately 14,000 deaths, 5,596 of those in London. Source 5 is from politician Edwin Chadwick, who describes the condition of the poor in 1832. This is from a report that Chadwick produced called the Sanitary Condition of the Labouring Population, something that we're going to have a look at in more detail in a future lesson. They merely pass dirty linen cloth through the dirty water. The smell of the linen itself, when so washed, is very offensive and must have injurious or bad effect upon the health of the occupants. The filth of their dwellings is offensive, and so is their personal filth. Some tasks then. Some more inference tasks. Remember, take this beyond the obvious. You're getting lots of practice at this now, so complete this to extend your understanding of this topic, or you can skip it to go on to the next section. Pause the video now if you're going to do these two tasks. They don't take very long, 5 minutes for each is plenty. Let's move on to the next section of your diagram now. Review the problems of 19th century public health and complete the following in the relevant box on your sheet. Which problems are linked? Explain why. You can use this writing frame to help you if you need to. And then, in your view, which problem was the most important? Use point, example, explain to justify your choice. Pause the video while you complete this section. So, some of the links. Quite clearly, increasing population is linked to the other two. It makes the spread of disease and the problem of filth and dirt all that much worse. Also, the Great Stink refers to the problem of the Thames becoming hugely contaminated with sewage, which in turn leads to further cholera outbreaks. Indeed, it was supposed that by solving the Great Stink, you would also solve the cholera. In a way, that did happen, but not for the reason that people thought at the time. So let's have a look at the solutions. You will see some detailed fact files now relevant to your study, which will have a look at the solutions. We will now consider the main solutions to the problems that we've already described, so you'll need to write down the solutions underneath the correct area. You'll need to identify which solutions solved which problem, because some solutions might have solved more than one, and also how the solutions might well be linked. So let's crack on with the first solution. Solution number 1, Dr. John Snow. There he is in the photograph. Dr. John Snow was the first man to correctly identify that cholera was caused by dirty water. He noticed that at Broad Street in London, and I've indicated part of Broad Street on the map there was a deadly cholera outbreak centred on the Broad Street water pump. Again, that's labelled on the map. This pump was popular for its reputation of taste and quality. He noticed that the people who drank the water often became ill and died, and that the workers at the nearby brewery, who drank only beer, survived. Snow demonstrated this on his map, which he marked where cholera deaths occurred, and he interviewed local people. He wrote up his findings, but he was ignored. If you look at the map there, every single one of those black marks refers to somebody in that household who died. You can see that some of them had absolutely horrific death tolls. Snow didn't end there though. He then personally removed the handle from the pump and the outbreak stopped virtually instantly. It later turned out that an underground cesspit full of sewage was leaking into the pump. After his death, Louis Pasteur's germ theory demonstrated why John Snow's idea was correct. Some tasks then. Identify which problem or problems were solved or partially solved by this solution. Then explain how this solved the problem. Pause the video now while you complete this next section of the diagram. And remember, it might not go immediately under one problem, it might solve more than one. Well, we can say that this problem partially solved cholera, but only partially. Remember that Dr. John Snow was not believed at the time, and there were further cholera outbreaks. But later, it would be proved that Dr. John Snow was right, and action to combat the cholera was more effective as a result. Let's extend our understanding of this a bit further by having a look at John Snow's map. Here is an even bigger section of it. You can see that these marks seem to get even thicker and even more numerous the closer to the Broad Street pump that you get. But clearly some people are travelling to the Broad Street pump from houses which are actually nearer to other pumps, which shows again its reputation for clarity and quality. There is the Broad Street pump. Here we can see the cholera deaths marked. And here we can see the brewery. No deaths because the workers drank only beer. Beer is boiled as part of its production methods, which sterilises the water and makes it safe. But also, curiously, over in Hampstead, about 4.5 miles away, one woman died of cholera, even though no one else on her street did. But John Snow investigated. Turns out that she had a daily bottle of water from the Broad Street pump delivered, as she used to live there and she missed the taste of it. Yuck. So that explains why she died. Previously, people had supposed that she had died as a result of miasma. Not the case. Also, Marlborough Mews pump. Few deaths were nearby this one. When interviewed, these households said that they got their water from the Broad Street pump, and that's why people were dying even there. Not the air again. Some follow-up tasks then. Explain how Dr. John Snow used this map to prove his theory was correct. You can use a writing frame, which I've included here, to help you explain your answer. Pause the video while you complete this. Clearly we can see that Dr. John Snow was very methodical and procedural with his approach, and this scientific approach really helped prove his point. Not that it helped him much at the time, people still didn't believe it. Solution number 2, Edwin Chadwick. There he is pictured. Edwin Chadwick was a politician. To begin with, he believed that the government shouldn't interfere with ordinary people's lives, but his investigations of living conditions changed his mind. He was a big believer in Jeremy Bentham's utilitarianism. You don't really need to know about this, but it's summed up by the phrase, the greatest good for the greatest number. Chadwick believed that there would always be some people who lost out, always be some people who did too well, but as long as the majority of people were well, then that was the best the government could do. In 1842, he visited working class populations and wrote a report called The Sanitary Conditions of the Labouring Population. In this report, he argued that disease was caused or made worse by filth and dirt. Poor people lived in terribly overcrowded and poor quality houses, and that these conditions caused disease because of the smells they caused. That's right, Chadwick believed in miasma. Chadwick didn't believe that you could force people to make changes for health reasons, only that you could recommend that they change things and try and show them the benefit of this. So identify which problem or problems are solved by this or partially solved. Explain how this solved the problem, and in what ways was Chadwick maybe wrong. What effect might this have on attempts to improve health? Pause the video here and complete the next section of your diagram. Remember, it might well solve more than one problem. So, it partially solves all three. Overcrowding, because Chadwick is recommending that changes be made to housing. The Great Stink, because it's recommending that changes are made which improve the quality of the air and prevent the miasma. And also, by just clearing things up, it would help prevent the cholera. The problem was Chadwick was wrong about miasma, and it meant that some of the solutions that he recommended wouldn't have actually done that much good. But others were quite simply common sense, would have made places cleaner, and would have done something to help. Some source skills to extend our knowledge further. Source 6 is from The Sanitary Conditions of the Labouring Population by Edwin Chadwick, published in 1842. Here he sets out some of his main ideas. Epidemic diseases are caused by decaying animal and vegetable substances, by damp and filth, and close and overcrowded dwellings. The annual loss of life from filth and bad ventilation is greater than the loss from death or wounds in any war. The most important and practical steps to take are drainage, the removal of rubbish from the streets, and the improvement of the supplies of water. The expense of public drainage and supplies of water should save money because there would be less money spent on sickness and mortality. To prevent further diseases, a district medical officer should be appointed for each area. Identify what Chadwick believes is the cause of disease and support this with a quote or two. Is Chadwick correct in his theories? Then give 3 examples from the source of what should be done to improve health according to Chadwick. In your view, how helpful would these actions be in improving public health? Pause the video now while you extend your learning. Well, firstly, Chadwick believes that the cause of disease is by bad air. So see that he refers to bad ventilation and also diseases being caused by decaying and animal and vegetable substances, by damp and filth, and the smells that are caused by that. Chadwick is incorrect in this respect, but he is correct in that filthy conditions can cause disease. So Chadwick it suggests that health might be improved with the following: better supplies of water, better drainage and sewerage, and also appointing a district medical officer to ensure that these things are done. And actually, these things would all be tremendously helpful in fighting disease. Which leads us to solution number 3, Joseph Bazalgette. Joseph Bazalgette terrified cholera with his facial hair. Actually, that's not true, but look at it, that's one hell of a moustache. Good on you, Joseph Bazalgette. Joseph Bazalgette was an amazing engineer. London still owes him a great debt of gratitude for his work. After the Great Stink of 1858, Bazalgette was asked by the Metropolitan Board of Works, which is the body in charge of building projects in London, to build a brand new sewer system to solve the stink from the Thames. Bazalgette's huge new sewers were mostly completed in 1865 and carried waste safely away from the city and kept the river flowing quickly and cleanly. He also made the sewers big enough to cope if London grew even bigger. They're only just starting to struggle now, and that's largely because of changes to what is actually washed down in these sewers. Bazalgette sewers not only solved the stink but also did a lot to prevent cholera ever returning by removing sewage from London's water and keeping it separate from drinking water sources, even though he didn't know that cholera was a waterborne disease. He was trying to solve the stink, but managed to solve the cholera anyway. Here's a picture of his sewers under construction, giving an idea of their scale. Bazalgette set out to solve the stink. He did, but he managed to clean up the water too, which is what actually stopped the cholera. So identify which problem or problems are solved or partially solved by this, explain how this solved the problem, and did Bazalgette actually understand what caused the cholera? Does this even matter? Pause the video now while you complete this next section. So Bazalgette partially solved the cholera and the Great Stink. In fact, arguably, he completely solved the Great Stink, but only partially solved the cholera. Part of this might be down to the fact that Bazalgette was another person who believed in the theory of miasma, but luckily the solution in getting rid of the bad air also had the effect of cleaning up the water too, so maybe it doesn't really matter. Solution number 4. Acts of Parliament. For a long time the governments had preferred a laissez-faire approach. This means do nothing. They believed that the government should not interfere with people's day-to-day lives, but nothing was no longer an option. After much reluctance, successive governments passed the following laws. You'll see more about these subsequently. The 1848 Public Health Act. This act recommended that local councils take control of public health problems in their areas, and it granted them the power to charge ratepayers or taxpayers to raise money to appoint a local board of health, use this money to keep the streets clean, improve the water supply and sewerage, and fight infectious diseases such as cholera. But, and this is crucial, the 1848 Public Health Act didn't force anyone to take action, so few councils actually took advantage of these new powers. People, who were actually taxpayers, who tended to be richer people, didn't see that this was doing anything to help them, and so they were reluctant to pay these extra taxes. So record the main details of the 1848 Public Health Act. Identify which problem or problems are solved by this or partially solved, what made this act an important step forward, but explain why its impact might be limited. Pause the video while you complete these tasks. Well, it partially solved all three. Some acts more than others, as we will see. But the 1848 Public Health Act is an important start. For the first time, the government is taking steps to be less laissez-faire and actually do something about the problem, although they're not quite prepared to commit to forcing or compelling people to act. So that makes it an important step forward, but it also limits its usefulness. But let's have a look at the next law. The 1866 Sanitary Act. This extended council powers to enable, but again not force, councils to improve drainage and sewerage for poor quality houses. But it also compelled or forced councils to locate and address nuisances to public health, although these were not well defined, so they were quite easy to ignore. Again, record the main details of the 1866 Sanitary Act. Identify which problem or problems are solved by this or partially solved, and explain how this act was an improvement to the 1848 Public Health Act. Pause the video while you complete this section. So this one again partially solves all three. But again, this act is just an improvement to the 1848 Act. The main improvement is that it compels or forced councils to address those issues of nuisances, but by not defining clearly what they were, councils found it easy to dodge. Now we've got the 1875 Public Health Act. This is where things really start to get somewhat better. This is the big one. Councils were now compelled or forced to charge rates or taxes to appoint a local board of health. To appoint a medical officer. This, by the way, is exactly what Chadwick had been recommending was done back in 1842. So to appoint a medical officer in charge of health and inspectors to ensure improvements were being made. To provide and maintain safe water supplies and sewers, and to regulate cellar housing and lodging houses to improve their quality and improve the quality of new streets and houses, although not deal with existing slums and certainly not ban them. While this was often unpopular with ratepayers, councils now had to act. It was no longer optional. You know the drill by now. Record the main details of the 1875 Public Health Act. Identify which problem or problems are solved or partially solved by it, and explain how this Act was an improvement to the 1848 Public Health Act and which aspects of public health were still not improved. Why might this be? Pause the video while you complete this. Again, this solves all three, and this one probably does the most to improve matters. It is because it compels the government to make councils act, and they now have to raise the taxes. People are no longer given a choice as to whether they pay into it or not. But it doesn't do everything. It would have been very difficult for them to ban cellar housing and lodging houses overnight. After all, that would then simply result in a load of people being made completely homeless and actually not improving their lives at all. That was a process that needed to happen a little bit more gradually, as we'll see. Our next act is the 1876 Artisans Dwellings Act. An artisan is basically a worker. Councils were now compelled again to forcibly buy slum housing from landlords. Landlords had to sell, they weren't given a choice. This would result in the demolition of slum housing and to replace it with housing of higher quality, and to get low interest loans from the government to pay for these improvements. Exactly how these improvements were implemented and how much landlords were paid was not outlined, but now there were more secure controls on the quality of housing for people. Identify which problem or problems are solved by this. Now complete the last box on your sheet. Which solutions are linked? Explain why. And in your view, which solution was the most important? This is a matter of opinion, so as long as you can back it up, you could well be right. Pause the video while you complete these final tasks and the bottom section of your sheet if that's how you're working. So, the problem that's partially solved here is population increase through overcrowding. Finally, something is being done about the quality of houses. Although it was gradual, and there was a lot of opposition to it. Slum landlords actually made a handsome profit off the horrible conditions that they made people live in. So perhaps we might not feel too sorry for them, but we can perhaps understand why they opposed such things. As for the links, well, there are loads of them. Maybe draw arrows between them. But for example, lots of these Acts of Parliament are based upon the ideas that came earlier of people like Edwin Chadwick. Also, things like the sewers that were built by Bazalgette are linked to the Great Stink and linked to Bazalgette's determination to get better water supplies in London and to keep the sewage away from the drinking water. So why was the 1875 Public Health Act passed? There were two main reasons why the government passed this law in 1875. One was Pasteur's germ theory, but also the government needed votes. Quite recently, more people had been included on the electoral register and what we call the franchise had been increased, although women still didn't have the vote, but more ordinary people did. What you're going to do now is you're going to sort the following statements into each category. They're going to be randomly displayed to begin with. Okay, pause the video here and start listing these factors underneath the appropriate heading. When you're done, we'll continue and have a look at the answers, and you can check them. Finished? Well, let's see what goes where. So Pasteur's germ theory proved that there was a scientific link between dirt and disease. In 1867, working men in towns were given the vote for the first time. The numbers of voters had doubled, and so the government actually needed to convince ordinary people that they were worth voting for. In 1884, working men in the country got the vote for the first time. But the theory of miasma would now fade away with Pasteur's germ theory being understood. Arguments supported by Snow, who claimed that water was responsible for the cholera. Pasteur's germ theory helped to demonstrate this. MPs wanted to win elections, they had to pass the laws to suit everyone, not just the wealthy. That's linked to getting more votes. With scientific proof, like Pasteur's germ theory, people were now willing to pay for improvements because they could see that the money wasn't being wasted. Many laws were passed to improve the lives of ordinary people, again to attract votes. Make any corrections necessary, and then press play when you're ready to continue. Let's consider the contribution of each of these people. Note down the contribution of Snow, Chadwick, Bazalgette, and the contributions of Government Acts of Parliament. Then, just for the sake of understanding it in your own head, give it a success rating out of 10. This doesn't have a specific meaning, but just make sure that it's comparative, so you can indicate who was really successful and who was maybe less successful. For example, snow wasn't believed to begin with, but it was important later on, so maybe he would have a lower impact than government acts that later build on each other and provide a lot of change. We're going to answer this question now. Germ theory was the most important breakthrough in 19th century public health. How far do you agree with this view? Explain your answer. Now, ordinarily in the real exam, if you're doing the Edexcel exam board, you'll be given some stimulus points here to help you out. However, you've got a whole load with you, and in fact I've given you 4 stimulus points just with those names underneath, so I'm not going to give you some specific stimulus points right now. Here's how you would answer this question though. Your first paragraph would need to show support for this interpretation, suggesting that germ theory perhaps was really important in some respects, maybe the most important. Point: germ theory was a very important breakthrough. An example of its importance is, the effect of this or the importance of this was, and this made it an important breakthrough because. Then paragraph 2 shows the importance of other factors. Think about what those were. So you would complete that in the same way, but for the other factors. Again, explaining it and linking it back to the question. But then in your conclusion, you need to make sure that you provide a very clear overall opinion. The question is asking how far, so you don't need to entirely agree, but you do need to come down on one side rather than just sitting on the fence. Overall, I agree or disagree to a large or small extent because this view is supported by, and this shows that germ theory or other factors were most important because. Then finally, you can evaluate your answer. This view is better supported by the evidence because, and that's where you start comparing the strength of your evidence and examples. If you did the success out of 10 section, then that will probably help you with it. This style of question will take about 30 minutes to produce, and it's really worth spending 5 minutes of that just jotting out a quick plan. Pause the video while you complete this task, and best of luck with it. So let's have a look at an example answer. I've colour-coded my answer to show where I've made a point, supported it with an example, further explained it, then linked it back to the question. Sections where I've evaluated it and tried to weigh out my answer are shown in black. I agree to a large extent that germ theory was the most important breakthrough in the 19th century public health because it made so many other breakthroughs possible and effective. Alright, so I've laid out my answer right away. That means I'm already going to be picking up marks for explanation. Germ theory was a very important breakthrough because it finally correctly identified the actual cause of disease. An example of its importance is it provided proof of Dr. John Snow's theory that cholera was spread by dirty water. The effect of this was to finally convince the government that clean water supplies and adequate sewerage were crucial to fighting the disease, not the removal of bad air and smells. This made it an important breakthrough because government actions to fight cholera and other diseases were now focused on the actual cause of infection, not inaccurate ideas such as miasma or the 4 humours. Although this was effective, it did take time for Pasteur's theories to be accepted, though eventually they were. Another reason why germ theory was important was because it helped influence government policy. An example of its importance is that it gave a scientific basis for compelling councils to act on poor sanitation and water supplies. The effect of this was the introduction of the 1848 Public Health Act and the more effective compulsory 1875 Public Health Act. These compelled councils to set up boards of health to ensure that adequate sanitation and water supply was maintained. This made germ theory important because at a time when taxpayers and councils were in favour of a laissez-faire approach and reluctant to act, it showed the scientifically proven need to address public health issues. Ratepayers and councils were initially reluctant to act, which might suggest that these laws were not especially important, but germ theory helped to change people's minds and provide the government with a case to make such laws compulsory, not voluntary. Okay, this answer isn't quite finished yet, but compare it to your answer. Are you evaluating effectively? Are you having a consistent opinion? Remember, you don't have to agree with my opinion, but you should try and kind of emulate the way in which I'm trying to be quite consistent with it. When you're ready to move on and you've made the improvements that you want to make, we'll have a look at the end of the answer. However, other factors were also important, such as the contribution of key individuals. Examples of these include Edwin Chadwick, who changed the government's approach to studying public health and the living conditions of the poor, and Joseph Bazalgette, who engineered London's first effective sewers. The effect of this was to eventually improve the sanitation in London, particularly to avoid a repeat of the Great Stink of 1858. This was important in the development of public health because both Chadwick and Bazalgette helped make improvements to the sanitation of London. However, this was not more important than germ theory. Both Chadwick and Bazalgette believed in the theory of miasma, and it was difficult for them to convince the government to change their laissez-faire approach. Only after the 1860s, when Pasteur's germ theory got greater acceptance, did more effective public health measures like the 1866 Sanitation Act begin to be brought in. Overall, I agree to a large extent that germ theory was the most important breakthrough in 19th century public health. This view is supported by the fact that the work of Dr. John Snow was proved by germ theory, and it showed how, while Chadwick's theories on the cause of disease were incorrect, his recommendations made sense and would be effective. This shows that germ theory was important, as it provided a scientific basis for effective public health legislation, such as the 1875 Public Health Act and the 1876 Artisans Dwellings Act. This made germ theory important because it overturned long-held incorrect beliefs about the cause of disease and helped to challenge the laissez-faire attitudes of government. While the contributions of key individuals and government actions were clearly very important too, it was germ theory that proved that action needed to be taken once and for all, and why that action would be effective in improving public health. Alright, you'll notice there that I've got quite a detailed but quite consistent evaluation, which really weighs up the strength of my argument. Pause the video again and make any necessary improvements to your answer. Okay, so this is quite a long answer, and a 16 marker should be quite long. So you might not be able to read these different paragraphs if they're too small. However, if you make this full screen, watch it in high definition, it should be perfectly legible. You might want to take a screenshot of this and refer to it as a model answer in the future. If you're going to do that, pause the video now and do so. Finally then, list 3 key individuals in the 19th century public health. Then explain why the 1875 Public Health Act was more effective than the 1848 Public Health Act, and overall, how effectively were the problems of 19th century public health solved. Pause the video now, consider those answers. Well, here's a list of individuals that you could name. Louis Pasteur would be indirectly responsible for some public health improvements through his germ theory. More directly, we've got Edwin Chadwick, pictured, Dr. John Snow and the Broad Street cholera outbreak, and Joseph Bazalgette. Explain why the 1875 Public Health Act was more effective than the 1848 one. Well, mostly because it forced councils to act rather than just recommending that they did. And how effectively were the problems of 19th century public health solved? Well, fairly effectively. For example, the cholera was a thing of the past, but there were still significant problems in the quality of housing. And of course, low wages severely impacted the health of the poor. Those are things that would only begin to be addressed in the early 20th century. More on that in a future lesson. But that concludes this quite long and substantial lesson on 19th century public health, focusing on London. I hope it's been useful to you, and if it has, give the video a like and subscribe to the channel. I'm going to be uploading even more lessons on public health and medicine through time, so keep checking back for more updates and more useful revision techniques. Thanks very much for watching, and goodbye.